Have you ever been in a situation where a small mistake led to big problems? Well, that's what happened to me, and I never expected things to turn out this way. Trust is crucial in any relationship, but it can be broken with just one wrong move. Unfortunately, I made that mistake, and I still regret it. I'm a 36-year-old woman married to my 40-year-old husband for 2 years. We both work at the local university where he's a respected professor, and I'm an assistant professor. I joined the university 3 years ago for a better salary and shorter working hours. We met at work, and my husband, who was part of my interview, became my crush. We spent a lot of time together, and our relationship grew from casual conversations to lunch dates. The mutual attraction led us to become a couple, and after a year, he proposed. We had a small wedding ceremony, and everything seemed perfect. We lived happily together, and I admired my husband's qualities. However, a small mistake I made a year into our marriage changed everything. A new assistant professor, George, joined the university, and one day when my husband was away, I ran into George at a cafe. We chatted, exchanged numbers, and promised to stay in touch. At the time, I didn't think much of it as I was happily married. Little did I know that this small mistake would lead to a series of events that disrupted my life over the next few weeks. George and I started texting each other. Initially, our messages were about work and hobbies, but over time they became flirtatious. It surprised me because I was sure everyone knew I was married. George began sending subtly flirtatious texts, and instead of ignoring them, I responded in a flirtatious manner. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. I only messaged him when my husband wasn't around to avoid getting caught. Then my husband and I had a major argument. He wanted to have a baby, but I had previously told him I wasn't ready for parenthood. Despite our prior discussions, he accused me of running away from responsibilities due to my nature. His hurtful words deeply upset me, and he left the house to have some space. Feeling upset and vulnerable, George messaged me, asking if I wanted to meet for a drink. I hesitated initially, but the temptation was strong, so I agreed to see him. Since my husband needed space, I felt it was fair for me to have some space as well. We chose a bar far from the university to minimize the chances of being recognized. The bar had a fantastic atmosphere with dim lights and soft music, creating the perfect setting. We indulged in drinks, and our conversation remained light and enjoyable. However, as the night wore on, things spiraled out of control, and I ended up getting extremely drunk, ordering multiple shots of vodka. George remained with me throughout the night, and our flirting became more intense. It felt like George and I were the only people in the world, and I momentarily forgot about the fight with my husband. Escaping the marital stress, even if only temporarily, was a relief. The chemistry between George and me was undeniable, unlike anything I had experienced before. That night, I made a terrible mistake by cheating on my husband. Afterward, George walked me to my cab, and as we waited on the pavement, he kissed me. He gave me enough time and space to pull away, but I didn't. I kissed him back. I was so intoxicated that I didn't fully grasp the situation until the following morning, waking up with a severe hangover. It took me some time to come to terms with the events of the previous night, and the memory of my kiss with George rushed back. I instantly thought, oh no, what have I done? I left the bedroom and found my husband in the kitchen, appearing much calmer than the day before. He asked where I had been the previous night, and I told him I had gone out with my friends. He nodded, apologized for the argument we had the day before, and reassured me that there was no rush to have a baby. He understood my concerns. Overwhelmed by guilt for my actions the previous night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had betrayed my husband's trust. While it was just a kiss, it weighed heavily on my conscience. I deeply regretted my mistake, but there was no way to undo it. I knew I had made a serious error in judgment, and the remorse was eating me up inside. I wanted to confess to my husband, but fear paralyzed me. I dreaded his reaction, fearing that he might discover my indiscretion and choose to leave me. Knowing him well enough, I understood that he wouldn't easily forgive something like this. Later, when I went back to my bedroom, I noticed text messages from George. He had messaged me the previous night, inquiring if I had arrived home safely. His texts also expressed his enjoyment of our kiss and a desire to meet again. Unable to bear the weight of my dishonesty any longer, I immediately blocked George. The guilt of not being truthful with my husband continued to eat away at me. Despite loving him deeply, the thought of breaking his heart with the truth was agonizing. Yet I couldn't muster the courage to confess what had transpired between George and me. Every night, I lay in bed motionless, replaying the moment when I made my terrible mistake. The guilt and fear pressed down on me like a physical burden, weighing on my chest. I had been carrying this guilt since that fateful day, yet I still lacked the courage to confess to my husband. Each time I tried to speak, my throat seemed to constrict, silencing me. So I made the painful choice to keep my secret. In the following weeks, I attempted to appear normal in front of my husband. However, every touch, every kiss from him left me feeling like a fraud, as if I were deceiving him, living a lie. I found myself trapped in a state of guilt and fear, unable to escape. Then one day, George attended a seminar organized by my department, and my husband was the guest speaker. Seeing George filled me with dread, as he was aware of our shared secret and could expose the truth if he wished. Fortunately, he chose to remain silent and never acknowledged me in any way during his time on campus. While relieved that he hadn't revealed our secret, my guilt only intensified, lurking like a ticking time bomb ready to detonate at any moment. The inevitable day of reckoning arrived on a Monday morning. I was running late for work, had a meeting with a colleague, and was already 10 minutes behind schedule. Hastily grabbing my bag and leaving the house, I realized I had left my phone at home. Panic briefly overcame me, but I decided to continue to the university, accepting that I would be tardy for my meeting. I couldn't afford to turn back and risk further delays. Upon my arrival at the university, I rushed to my meeting, a sense of unease gnawing at me. Despite the meeting being productive, the feeling that something was amiss lingered. As soon as the meeting concluded, I hurried back to my office, my anxiety growing. Upon opening the door, a startling sight awaited me. My husband was seated at my desk, holding my phone and scrolling through my messages. I stood frozen, realizing that a reckoning was imminent. My small mistake had finally caught up with me. My husband raised his eyes to meet mine, a profound sense of betrayal etched in his gaze. At that moment, I felt like the greatest fool on earth. He rose from his seat and handed me my phone, his voice barely above a whisper as he questioned, "Why did you do it?" He had meticulously examined my text messages with George, reading our flirtatious exchanges, references to the kiss, and the content of our texts. I found myself utterly speechless, aware that there was no justification for my actions. All I could do was lower my head in shame and await the consequences. My husband explained how he had sensed something amiss in my behavior during the past few weeks, believing it was related to our disagreement about having a baby. Consequently, he had offered me space, assuming I was still upset. He expressed his disbelief, saying, "I never thought you'd betray me like this." He left my office without uttering another word, leaving me alone with my overwhelming guilt and shame. I recognized that I had irreparably damaged his trust, uncertain if I could ever regain it. For what felt like hours, I sat at my desk, numbed by shock and remorse. I had obliterated the most precious aspect of my life, my marriage, all due to a thoughtless kiss. Later, I returned home, compelled to clarify the situation with my husband, emphasizing my love for him. He sat on the living room couch, sipping his whiskey. Approaching him, I attempted to hold him, explaining what had occurred. However, he rebuffed my touch and pushed me away, his eyes filled with cold detachment and seething anger. I understood that I had deeply wounded him, and there seemed to be no way to make amends. An urgent need to elucidate the situation engulfed me. I confessed that the kiss had been a result of extreme intoxication, emphasizing it was merely a kiss. He regarded me with intense anger but remained silent before ultimately leaving the house. In the following days, my husband barely uttered a word to me. It was as if I had become invisible. Despite my pleas for forgiveness, he steadfastly avoided making eye contact or acknowledging me. I felt like a wandering ghost within our home, devoid of purpose. Weeks passed with us coexisting under the same roof but seldom exchanging words. Despite my attempts to bridge the gap, he consistently rebuffed my advances, refusing even to meet my gaze. Every effort I made proved futile, including trying to embrace him while he slept, only to be met with rejection. Initially, I harbored hope that our relationship could mend through my persistent efforts to earn his forgiveness. I believed we could discuss what had transpired and find a path forward. However, it appeared my husband had already made up his mind about the course of action he wanted to take. One day, he approached me expressing a desire to talk. I eagerly listened, hoping for a sign of forgiveness and a chance to restore our relationship. Unfortunately, my hope was swiftly shattered when he requested that I vacate the house. He explained his need for space to clear his thoughts, emphasizing the difficulty of doing so with me present. I was devastated by this turn of events, unable to fathom that it had come to this. Though I didn't contest his decision, a small part of me clung to the possibility that our time apart might rekindle our connection. I rented a modest apartment in town and relocated from our home. Leaving the house was an emotional struggle, and I didn't pack all my belongings, clinging to the hope of returning and resuming life with my husband. Adjusting to my solitary existence in the apartment proved to be a lonely and challenging experience. Without his presence, I spent the majority of my days often in tears, dwelling on the regrettable events that had unfolded. Sometimes, I sought refuge from my troubles by burying myself in work. I had requested to work from home because I was too overwhelmed by depression to face the outside world. One fateful day, the head of my department delivered shocking news. I had been immediately terminated from my job. I was left in a state of disbelief. It seemed as if my life was unraveling, with my marriage, home, and now my career crumbling before me. I had invested my heart and soul into my job only to have it abruptly taken away due to a foolish error. To my surprise, it appeared that my husband played a role in this unfortunate outcome. While he had always exhibited controlling tendencies, I never imagined he would go to such lengths. Despite my desperate pleas, the head of the department remained resolute in their decision. They revealed that my husband had personally called and demanded my termination, threatening to resign if they did not comply. He had wielded his influence and authority within the university to orchestrate my dismissal. Left without a job and a place to call home, I felt utterly adrift and powerless. The weight of guilt and shame for my transgressions still burdened my heart, and now I had to grapple with the repercussions of my husband's vengeful actions. Days turned into weeks, and I struggled to make ends meet. My savings were meager, and despite applying for jobs far and wide, I received no offers. I felt like a failure in every aspect of my life. However, an unexpected turn of events occurred when George reached out to me. He had resorted to emailing me since I had blocked his contact on my phone. Retrieving my mail wasn't a challenge since George also worked as a professor at the university where I used to be employed. He informed me that he had heard about my situation and expressed a desire to assist me. Initially, I hesitated because in many ways, he was the root cause of my predicament. I was already without a job, and my husband harbored strong resentment toward me. Unable to fathom how things could worsen, I decided to meet George to see what he had in mind. Our rendezvous took place at a cozy cafe near my apartment. George was impeccably dressed in a sharp suit and wore a charming smile. He kindly offered to buy me a coffee, and we settled at a small table by the window. As I poured out my troubles to him, he attentively listened. I divulged the entire saga involving my husband, my job loss, and my life spiraling out of control. Speaking with him brought a sense of relief, as if a heavy burden was finally lifting from my chest. It marked the first time I had shared my ordeal with someone. After I had finished recounting my troubles, George remained silent for a moment. Then he leaned forward and gently took my hand. In a soft tone, he apologized, expressing his unawareness of the extent of my suffering. His gaze locked onto mine, and for an instant, I felt myself immersed in his eyes, which held a warmth and kindness I hadn't encountered in a long time, almost providing solace. "I want to help you," he offered, his gesture comforting. Despite appreciating his offer, I initially declined, fearing it would only further enrage my husband. I didn't want to exacerbate the situation. However, as my circumstances grew increasingly dire with each passing day, I found myself contemplating George's proposition more seriously. With no other viable options and believing in George's genuine intent to assist, I reached out to him. He had connections within the academic realm and promised to aid me in securing a new job. My attempts to communicate with my husband had been futile. He had been avoiding my calls and refused to acknowledge my existence. I had called him repeatedly to discuss my job termination, but his silence was deafening. Thus, I informed George of my change of heart, and he proceeded to help me secure a new position at a different university. I had a glimmer of hope that my life was finally getting back on track. Securing a job marked the first step toward making everything right. George also assisted me with my CV and cover letter, and I expressed deep gratitude for his help. We hadn't been friends for long, yet this guy was going above and beyond for me. I suspected that George was motivated to help me due to his own guilt regarding what had transpired. We refrained from any flirting or inappropriate behavior. His approach to assisting me in finding a job was sincere. My thoughts often drifted to my husband, and I yearned to earn his forgiveness. I made an attempt to speak with him at the university, but he didn't even acknowledge me, simply instructing me to leave. My desperation to win back his forgiveness was growing. Weeks passed, and I settled into my new job. The work was demanding but fulfilling, and I was gradually rebuilding my life. Despite multiple attempts, my husband never answered my calls or responded to my messages. I continued to reside alone in my small apartment, with George as my sole confidant, just as I was finding stability in my work. I was unexpectedly terminated from that job as well, and I suspected that my husband was behind this setback too. I visited my husband at his home and confronted him, questioning what he wanted by continuously taking away my job opportunities. He grew furious and claimed that I should have considered the consequences before cheating on him. My husband had learned from his friends that I had obtained my new job with George's assistance, which led him to believe I was having an affair with George. He expressed his hatred for me and wished he had never met me. His intense anger frightened me. I attempted to explain that nothing was happening between me and George. He was merely helping me find work. I swore it was the truth, but my husband remained skeptical. In my desperation, I tried to justify the events of that fateful night once more, emphasizing how intoxicated I had been with too many vodka shots. However, my husband scoffed at my attempts, refusing to accept my justifications. That night, it felt like I had lost my husband. The distance and iciness in his voice made it evident that he no longer wanted anything to do with me. Tears welled up in my eyes as I left his house, this time with the sinking feeling that I might never return. I continued applying for jobs elsewhere, only to face rejection at every turn. I also distanced myself from George. Seeing him brought back the guilt of that night when we kissed and served as a painful reminder of all that followed. One day, as I returned to my apartment following another job interview, I discovered an envelope awaiting me. It contained divorce papers sent by my husband. Tears welled up as I gazed at the papers, realizing that my marriage was ending because of my actions. It hit me hard, understanding that a single kiss had unraveled my entire world. I never imagined that one mistake could cost me my marriage and much more. Yet here I was, alone and without anyone to lean on. My circle of friends in town was limited, and those I knew were also friends of my husband, making it unlikely they would side with me at the cost of their friendship with him. My family had moved to another state due to my dad's job transfer. The following days felt like a painfully extended nightmare. I cycled through various emotions from sadness and anger to guilt and despair. Eventually, I reached a point where I felt nothing at all and recognized that the only path forward was to gradually rebuild my life on my own. I took a deep breath, wiped away my tears, and realized it was time to confront reality and move forward. I made the difficult decision to sign the divorce papers. There was no point in fighting for my marriage when my husband had given up on it and understandably on me. I accepted the responsibility for my actions and understood his decision. I signed the papers and visited my husband's house to deliver them and collect my remaining belongings. He opened the door and allowed me in. After giving him the papers, I explained that I needed to gather my things as well. He simply nodded and stepped aside to grant me access to the bedroom. While going through my belongings, I stumbled upon a small note my husband had written for our first anniversary. It read, "I love you more than anything in this world. You are my life, my soulmate, and my partner in crime. Happy anniversary, my love." The note brought tears streaming down my face. How had things gone so awry? How did our love dissipate? I packed my belongings as best as I could and left his house, hoping for a fleeting longing glance from him, but only encountering coldness in his eyes. Upon returning to my apartment, I decided to take a break from everything and embarked on a walk. Lost in thought, I wandered aimlessly and failed to notice an oncoming car speeding toward me. A stranger intervened, pulling me to safety just in the nick of time. This incident jolted something within me. I resolved not to remain a damsel in distress any longer and to seize control of my life. I sent a message to my husband, stating that if he was resolute in his decision, I wished for the divorce to be expedited. He didn't respond directly, but his lawyers contacted me and assured me that the divorce proceedings would be swift, outlining the terms, including a fair division of my husband's life earnings. After the divorce, I acknowledged that I didn't merit financial support from my ex-husband, who wasn't willing to share willingly. Despite losing my job and needing the money, I asked the lawyers to convey to him that I didn't require his money or assets. Unfortunately, this didn't lead to his forgiveness. Our divorce proceedings commenced promptly, and during court appearances, my husband never acknowledged me, communicating solely with his attorneys. The court granted our divorce within 3 months. Despite clinging to hope until the last moment, my husband seemed relieved to sever all ties with me. After the divorce, I had lunch with a friend who revealed that my ex-husband had begun dating again. I probed for more information, but she remained tight-lipped. Realizing the extent of my grave error, I couldn't fathom moving on, while he seemed to have done so effortlessly. To escape the pain of encountering him with someone new, I decided to leave town. I secured a job in a nearby town with a lower salary and relocated. Some days are tough, and I'm contemplating therapy to alleviate the guilt weighing on me. Regarding inquiries about my well-being, I appreciate the concern. I'm uncertain if I'm okay, and processing everything remains challenging. Reflecting on the past few months often leads to breakdowns. Attempts to contact my ex-husband post-divorce were futile, and he blocked my number in social media. Over a year since my last update, despite therapy and attempts to reach out, he remains silent, blocking me from his life. In a recent setback, I needed his signature for document verification and visited his town. However, I discovered he had moved on, living with a pregnant woman. The encounter triggered breakdowns, and I realized I cannot escape the weight of guilt and regret. It will always be with me.